Hello. So today I'm in more natural light, as you can see, so I look a lot better. But my hand's glowing white. But anyway, I wanted to talk about Emily Brontë and her only novel, published in 1847, Wuthering Heights. Now, for some background, Emily Brontë is related to Anne and Charlotte Brontë, who are also English novelists. And Emily only published one book, but she was also a poet. She published Wuthering Heights under the pseudonym Alice Bell, and it was published in 3 volumes, despite Wuthering Heights only taking up 2, with the third being taken up by her sister Anne's novel, Agnes Grey. Wuthering Heights is a very, very, very dramatic novel. It's constant throughout the book. There's constant tragedy and emotional turmoil, and then some. It's also a bit of a strange novel in the sense that it begins in the quote-unquote present of the book, and then it goes back 20 years, and then it catches up to the present. The book, when it begins, is set in 1801, but it starts 30 or so years in the past, when Heathcliff and Catherine, the main characters, are children. Now, to briefly summarize the book, it starts when this man comes to Wuthering Heights during a winter storm, Mr. Lockwood, and he's caught in a storm and he comes here for shelter, and he ends up taking up residence at Thrushcross Grange, which is a bit of a ways from Wuthering Heights, and it's where a lot of the book takes place, along with at Wuthering Heights. So, when he takes up residence, Mr. Lockwood and his new housekeeper, Nellie Dean, she begins to tell him the history of Wuthering Heights and its proprietor, Heathcliff. Now, it goes back about 30 years, but Nellie Dean has been with the family for a long time. So, how it goes is the old master of Wuthering Heights, Mr. Earnshaw, adopted Heathcliff off the streets and took him in as his adopted son. Mr. Earnshaw has 2 other children, Catherine and Hindley, and they initially dislike Heathcliff a lot because he's usurped them as their father's favorite. But eventually, Catherine and Heathcliff grow very close. Now, later on, Mr. Earnshaw dies, and Hindley becomes master, and he forces Heathcliff out to work in the fields. And meanwhile, Catherine is beginning to associate with the Lintons, who live at Thrushcross Grange at the moment, and their children Edgar and Isabella. Now, the plot progresses first by Catherine saying that she doesn't love Heathcliff in that way, and she loves Edgar, and she would never marry him. But actually, she does love him, and she thinks of him like her soulmate, and saying that they complete each other. And Heathcliff, he hears this, and he just runs off. He can't take it, and he disappears for a few years. Now, fast forward 3 or so years, and Catherine and Edgar Linton, are married. And they're married, and they move to Thrushcross Grange, and they're just living their life. And Heathcliff comes back, and he begins to, in simplest terms, he begins to wreak havoc on their lives. He is still madly in love with Catherine, but Catherine splits her affection for him with her affection for Edgar, her lawful husband. In the meantime, Heathcliff begins to really take over. He begins to take over Wuthering Heights and take over Hindley's place as the owner. And the plot progresses to a point where Heathcliff and Edgar are openly contesting for Catherine's affections. And by the end of the first volume, he is basically defeated and he retreats, but he comes back for revenge in the second volume. The first volume deals with Heathcliff's love for Catherine and Catherine's inner turmoil and having to split herself between what is societally acceptable and what she actually feels. Now, by the end of the first volume and the beginning of the second, Catherine has a daughter also named Catherine, and then Catherine the elder dies, which is very sad. And it explains why earlier in the book, in the first few chapters, Heathcliff has a breakdown and begins shouting her name. That's really all I can say. He breaks down emotionally, and in a fit of grief and sorrow, he begins shouting her name because he misses her dearly. In the second novel, it deals with Heathcliff's vengeance and the consequences of his love for Catherine. Catherine Edgar's daughter, also named Catherine, grows up somewhat isolated from Wuthering Heights, and in the meantime, Heathcliff actually took a wife, Edgar's sister Isabella, and he has a son with her. And Heathcliff also takes in Hindley's son, Hareton, or is it Hareton? I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but he takes him in, and he is an absolute monster to both of them. His son, Linton, and his adopted son, Hareton. Now, gradually, Cathy, who is Edgar and Catherine's daughter, I'll be referring to as Cathy from henceforth, Cathy begins to slowly grow closer to Wuthering Heights, in the sense that she is more drawn to it, and also she is forced into a relationship with Heathcliff's son, Linton. Now, it gets to a point where Cathy is forced to live at Wuthering Heights and marry Linton, but tragically, Linton dies. And by this point, they're only around 17 or 18 years old, so they're still young. But Cathy has already been taken practically as a prisoner and forced to marry someone who she does not love in that way. She does not exactly have romantic feelings for him, even though it's somewhat implied that she might. Now, Linton dies, and then at that point, the story cuts off, and Mr. Lockwood, who is listening to Nellie Dean's story, leaves for a bit and then comes back in a few months, only to find out that Cathy and Hareton have fallen in love and are planning to get married. No one seems to mention in the book that they're cousins, or seems appalled by it because it was more normal at the time, even though they are aware that they are first cousins. Now, at this point, Heathcliff is dead, Linton is dead, Edgar is dead, Catherine the Elder is dead, and the entire old generation has passed. Heathcliff himself, over the course of a few days, stops eating and drinking, and eventually simply passes away in bed, somewhat peacefully, one might say, because he seems at peace with his fate, and he finally gets to see Catherine again. And the story ends there, with the fates of the characters ultimately left unclear, but it's very likely that Hareton and Cathy get married and have children. Now, the book is just extremely dramatic, but not in a bad way, because I think the drama was very well done. It's done in a way where it's overly dramatic and it's very almost melodramatic, like something you'd see in a soap opera. But it's so entertaining that it's hard to not like it and almost care for these characters and feel pity for them. For example, even though Heathcliff is an absolute monster to his son, he's emotionally and physically abusive, it's implied, and he's awful to his adoptive nephew and son, Hareton. He makes him work like a beast and does not let him read and puts him down constantly. You almost feel bad for him because everything that he's done is almost a sort of retaliation for everything done against him in his own life and how he couldn't have Catherine for himself and love her. And it's worth mentioning that in the book, Heathcliff is described differently from all the other characters. He's described as having darker hair and darker skin than the more fair-toned, lighter-haired characters like Cathy or Hindley. So from the very get-go, he's an outcast of a character. He's not blood, he's a street rat, and he is very likely just not white. I believe he's described at some point like a gypsy, but it's important to understand that he's not entirely accepted, not only by the families in the area, but also by society at large, because he's not white. or he's not pure, I guess you could say. And it's important to remember that throughout the course of the book. It's really easy to just feel bad for these characters. Catherine has to hide her true emotions, and she can't be honest with herself, partially because she really does love Edgar and she does love Heathcliff, but also because it's hard for her at the time to do what she really wants, because divorce was a lot harder back then in the late 18th, early 19th century. And even then, you feel bad for people like Edgar, who is subject to this man intruding in his personal life, his married life, and characters like Kathy, who's forced into a marriage, and Linton, who's subject to emotional and physical abuse. Basically, you feel bad for all these characters because they're all subject to pains from others that they aren't really deserving of. They don't deserve to be treated the way they are, but because of societal pressures and pressures from each other in their own personal lives, they're almost forced into situations that are not exactly favorable to them. One major point that must be addressed is the setting of the story. It's set in the Yorkshire moors, and there's a great reference to the book in Friends, the TV show Friends, where Phoebe and Rachel are taking a literature class, and Phoebe says that the moors sort of represent Heathcliff's tumultuous and wild soul. And I think that's a really good point. I think the moors and in general the setting show a very wet and dismal and stormy side, not only of Heathcliff, but of the entire story in itself. There are several storms throughout the story that really push the plot along, like the initial winter storm in the beginning, and there are several rainstorms and winter storms throughout the novel that really force characters to be at certain places at certain times, and certain emotional storms, like when Heathcliff almost attacks Edgar, or Catherine. And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on points. And oh yeah, here's another good point. The generations really seem to mirror each other and run parallel to each other. For example, Heathcliff cannot have Catherine at his age, but his son Linton can have Kathy. Of course, they're both forced into marriages. Kathy and Linton, I mean. Oh, and Kathy and her daughter Kathy. Catherine and her daughter Kathy are both almost forced into marriages that aren't really their own decisions. But in the end, almost as a breaking of tradition, Kathy finds love with Hareton, and this was totally natural, because gradually Kathy began to grow accustomed to and even enjoy Hareton's presence and began teaching him how to read and write. And Hareton finds great joy in this, because throughout his entire life he was treated as nothing more than physical labor, as a brute. He was never educated, he was mistreated constantly, and now here's someone who genuinely enjoys spending time with him and teaching him things. Whereas in the previous generation, there was never that choice of love and relationships. Catherine was almost forced to marry Edgar because of societal norms, and because their families were simply aligned in that way as almost a sort of alliance. And Heathcliff just absolutely wrecks that and leaves it in shambles. But in the new generation, there's actually this choice of being able to choose who you marry and who you love. And there's a lot of choices in the book, by which I mean that people often are forced into choices in this novel, like how Heathcliff almost never chose to come to Wuthering Heights. He was just picked off the street. And how Catherine had to choose between Edgar and Heathcliff. And how Kathy, her daughter, had no choice but to grow up isolated, and then was forced to be isolated further at Wuthering Heights. And in general, the story just rolls along like this constantly. It's just tragedy and drama and shouting and screaming and fighting. One example of this, Heathcliff's wife Isabella runs away from him and ends up living in London for several years, raising their son without his knowledge. And then she dies, and Linton comes in, and he's just a sickly child who can't socialize and lives under his father's thumb. And in general, I would say that the story rolls along in this way, and it rolls along quite well. Initially, the story throws a lot at you in terms of plot and characters and drama. First, you'll have Heathcliff being adopted, and then Hindley being tyrannical and forcing Heathcliff and Cathy apart, and then you'll have Heathcliff turning into a brooding monster and Hindley being a drunk, and Heathcliff and Edgar fighting over Catherine. But eventually the story settles into a consistent pace of drama with little pieces of melancholic happiness. In the end, Heathcliff is reunited with Catherine in spirit, because throughout the book, it seems to him that he's haunted by Catherine. In the beginning, Mr. Lockwood dreams of Catherine hearing voices at the window, and Heathcliff comes in and he just has a breakdown. He wants to be with Catherine again. And later, Heathcliff says that Catherine will be haunting him even after she dies, and in a sense that's true, because everything he's done after that is almost with the memory of Catherine still in his mind, like how he forces his son and Cathy together, and how he takes over Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights, and how he has all these things and all this power over people, but he doesn't have the person that he loves most in the world. And he's eventually he dies, and he's spiritually reunited with her, you can say. And it's almost a happy ending for him, because all he really wanted in life was to be with Catherine. Of course, now that he's dead, he can't really be with her in person. But you could say that it's a happy ending for him overall, because he's finally at peace with the memory of Catherine and with the memory of himself and all that has happened. And he can finally rest knowing that he'll at least be dead and he won't feel the pain of not having Catherine with him anymore. And all the other characters do have some of a happy ending. Cathy and Hareton are getting married, Nellie can more or less retire, and Mr. Lockwood has a story to tell. And so, moving on to the general review. The story is written in a very unorthodox way, I would say, for the time at least. It's written in an unorthodox way where it's spliced up and you're catching up to the present. Emily Bronte's writing is very sharp. She's good at describing things and creating an atmosphere, and I think that part comes from her experience as a poet and her work as a poet. And I think she does a great job really creating these characters and making them feel real and making the world itself feel real. She is able to create these characters that we can feel very sympathetic towards. And even though they do some absolutely horrible, remonstrable things like emotional abuse and manipulation and so forth. Overall, I would say I'll give this a 4 out of 5. It's great writing, great characters. The drama is memorable, and it really leaves an imprint on you. Like, you really feel like you're going through the story, and you're living it yourself, and you're watching the events unfurl. I would say the major drawback of the story is also the drama, because it begins very choppy, and sometimes it's almost too much. It's almost overwhelming how much is going on and all the characters' motivations. And overall, I would say you could spend a lot of time going through every character and figuring out what they want and what their motivations are. But I think that's not enough to make this a bad story or a bad book. I've read some reviews, and people tend to either really like or really dislike the book. And I think it really comes from the drama itself and what's going on. I think people either love or hate the book because of the characters and what they do to themselves and to each other. Overall, 4 out of 5. So when I have a book review next, I will put that up. I don't know what it's gonna be, but I think it might be Tacitus. So keep an eye out. See ya.